When the first light of morning filtered through the thin curtains of a quiet Beijing apartment, Menglong stirred awake to the familiar sound of laughter, soft, melodic, and unmistakably hers. Xing Fei was sitting by the window, sunlight draping her in gold, lost in the pages of a worn-out book they had bought together years ago during a spontaneous trip to Hangzhou. For a fleeting second, he simply watched her, wondering how a single person could hold so much light within them. Their love story didn't begin with fireworks. It began with timing, or rather, with a coincidence that felt like fate. They met not at a romantic getaway or glamorous event, but on the set of a drama neither of them expected would change their lives. Menglong had been cast as the male lead, stoic and composed, while Xing Fei was the spirited heroine whose laughter seemed to fill every corner of the studio. At first, they were simply colleagues, but the camera has a way of capturing truths the heart tries to hide, and as the days turned into nights and the script blurred with reality, they began to realize that some scenes didn't need rehearsing. Off-screen, their friendship unfolded naturally. They discovered they shared an odd number of habits: the same taste in bubble tea, the same love for quiet bookstores, the same fascination with old songs from the 90s. He admired her energy, how she could find beauty in chaos. She adored his calm, how he could steady her world with just a glance. Together, they became a quiet balance, his stillness her spark, his patience her passion. Their first real moment, the one neither of them could quite forget, happened one rainy afternoon. The crew had wrapped early, and most people had already gone home. Xing Fei stood under the canopy, holding a paper cup of coffee, frowning at the rain that refused to stop. Without a word, Menglong walked over, opened his umbrella, and held it out to her. But instead of sharing it, he handed it to her, then stood in the downpour, smiling. "You'll catch a cold," she protested. He shrugged, raindrops dripping down his hair. "Then you'll have to make me ginger tea." That was the beginning. Not a declaration, not a grand confession, just a simple exchange that lingered in both their hearts. Over the years, they built their world quietly, away from the flashes and gossip. Their love wasn't one that demanded attention. It was the kind that existed between glances and gestures, in the way he remembered her coffee order, or how she always saved him the last dumpling. When they worked together again, fans noticed something different, a tenderness in their eyes that no script could have directed. People whispered, speculated, shipped them endlessly, but the two simply smiled. Some stories are too sacred to confirm. They're meant to be felt. There were moments of doubt, too. Fame isn't kind to private hearts. They face the weight of expectations, the endless schedules, the distance that comes when two people chase dreams that sometimes lead to different cities. There were nights when they spoke through screens, their faces pixelated by poor connections, but their hearts close enough to hear each other breathe. "Do you ever wish we were just ordinary?" Xing Fei asked once. Menglong thought for a long moment before replying, "No. Ordinary people meet by chance. We met by destiny." Their memories became a mosaic of small, luminous moments. The first time they cooked together, a disaster of burnt noodles and laughter. The road trip through Yunnan, where they sang off-key to old songs and got lost only to find a tiny village that served the best rice wine. The time she fell asleep during a long flight, and he stayed awake the entire night, just watching the rise and fall of her breath, memorizing the peace on her face. One spring, they visited the cherry blossoms in Kyoto. The air was filled with petals that floated like snow, and she tried to catch them, childlike and giddy. "You know," she said, "they fall so quickly. It's like love, beautiful but gone too fast." He looked at her and replied, "That's only if you don't hold on." And when she turned to him, he was already holding out his hand. That was the moment she knew she didn't have to chase anything. He would always be there. Years passed, and the world around them changed. New roles, new fans, new stories to tell. But their own story never aged. They grew in quiet companionship, learning that love isn't a constant flame, but a steady warmth that survives the seasons. Sometimes, when work kept them apart, they left notes for each other, a habit that became a secret language. A post-it on the fridge saying, "Don't forget your scarf." Another tucked into a script, "I'm proud of you." These fragments of affection, invisible to everyone else, were the threads that held them together. There was one winter when the snow wouldn't stop falling. They were shooting in the mountains, and the cold was biting. Between takes, Xing Fei's hands trembled. So Menglong quietly took her gloves, warmed them between his palms, and slipped them back on her hands. She laughed and said, "You always act like my heater." He smiled. "You make it easy to care." That small gesture made it into fan photos and interviews, but what people didn't know was that later that night he tucked a snowflake pendant into her pocket. "So you'll always carry a piece of today." She still wears it sometimes. Their love was never loud. It was soft, consistent, and deeply human. When misunderstandings arose, they didn't argue, they listened. When fame tried to pull them into different worlds, they met halfway. And through it all, they never forgot the promise they made, to always find their way back, no matter how far they roamed. One of their most cherished memories came on an ordinary day. No cameras, no red carpets. It was early autumn. They went back to the old drama set where it all began, now abandoned and overgrown with ivy. She walked through the empty courtyard, touching the wooden doorframe where their first scene was filmed. "Feels like a lifetime ago," she said. Menglong nodded, picking up a fallen leaf. "It feels like yesterday." Then he handed her the leaf and whispered, "For every yesterday we had, there's a tomorrow waiting." That night, they sat on the rooftop watching the city lights. The air smelled like rain, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you think people will remember us?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes soft. "They'll remember our stories, but I'll remember you." The beauty of their love lay not in its perfection, but in its persistence, how it survived the noise, the distance, and the passage of time. They didn't need to shout it to the world. They lived it quietly, authentically. In a world obsessed with spectacle, their story was a rare whisper of truth. Like theirs don't need an ending. They simply keep unfolding. In memories, in the songs they both love, in the moments when their eyes still find each other across a crowded room. Maybe someday they'll tell the world, or maybe they won't. Maybe they'll continue to live quietly, their story tucked between the pages of scripts and stolen glances. The night was silent except for the faint hum of the city, that quiet, intimate sound that only lovers who've spent years together can hear. Menglong stood by the balcony, hands tucked into his pockets, eyes fixed on the skyline. Behind him, Xing Fei wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her chin against his back. "You're thinking again," she whispered. He smiled faintly, turning his head just enough to catch her eyes. "Only about how lucky I am." They had reached a point in their love where words were no longer necessary, where silence itself spoke volumes. But sometimes the heart insists on remembering, on replaying every beginning, every almost, every fragile second that shaped their story. She remembered the early days, the nervous laughter, the teasing banter, the subtle glances that lingered a heartbeat too long. On set, he was professional, always calm, always focused. Yet behind that quiet exterior, there was a warmth that disarmed her completely. When the camera stopped rolling, he'd sneak her tiny smiles, the kind that stayed with her long after the scene ended. One evening, after an especially emotional scene, she couldn't hold back her tears. The exhaustion of work, the weight of expectation, it all came crashing down. Menglong didn't say anything. He simply walked up to her, took her hand, and led her out into the cool night air. "Look up," he said. Above them, 1,000 stars stretched across the black sky. "They're always there," he murmured, "even when you can't see them." That night, she learned that comfort didn't always come in words. Sometimes it came in silence, shared by two hearts that understood each other. Their relationship blossomed in quiet corners of the world. Between filming schedules and long flights, they carved time for themselves. A day by the sea, a walk through the crowded night markets, a simple breakfast made together in laughter. Once, during a shoot in Thailand, they found themselves stranded in a sudden tropical rainstorm. Everyone ran for cover, but they stayed, soaked, breathless, laughing as the world around them blurred into silver rain. She spun in circles, arms wide, hair plastered to her face, and he couldn't help but think she was the most beautiful chaos he'd ever seen. When she stopped spinning, he pulled her close, their foreheads touching, rain dripping between them. "If I could freeze this moment," he whispered, "I'd never let it go." Their love wasn't perfect, it was human. There were moments of distance, of misunderstanding. Fame demanded attention, and sometimes it came at the cost of presence. She was often filming abroad, while he worked on projects in other provinces. Time became both their enemy and their test. There were nights when messages replaced touch, and calls filled the spaces where laughter used to live. But no matter how far apart they drifted, they always found their way back. As if drawn by an invisible thread, neither could break. One of their most unforgettable reunions happened at an airport in Shanghai. It had been months since they last saw each other. As she stepped out of the terminal, exhausted from a red-eye flight, she spotted him waiting by the exit. No disguise, no attempt to hide. He simply stood there, holding a single white rose. When she reached him, she wanted to speak, but before she could, he said softly, "You're home." That was all it took for the tears to fall. They began documenting their quiet moments, not for the world, but for themselves. Tiny clips of shared meals, photos of sunsets, messages scribbled on napkins. A memory box slowly filled with fragments of their journey. A ticket stub from their first movie together, the coffee sleeve from the cafe where they confessed their feelings. A seashell she found and claimed looked like his smile. Each item carried a heartbeat, a whisper of something eternal. There was one memory, however, that neither of them could forget: the night under the lanterns. It was the Mid-Autumn Festival, and they were far from home, shooting in a small town by the river. The locals invited the cast to release paper lanterns, and as they lit theirs, Xing Fei wrote on it, "For all the dreams we haven't yet dreamed." Menglong added, "And for the ones we're already living." They released it together, watching it rise into the velvet sky, drifting among hundreds of other glowing wishes. For a long time, they stood hand in hand, their eyes following that single golden light until it became a star. Years later, when interviews brought up questions about love, he would smile and say, "Love is in the quiet things, not the grand gestures, but the everyday moments that remind you you're not alone." Fans thought it was poetic, but she knew he was talking about her. Sometimes, when life slowed down, they would return to that same river. It had become their secret place, untouched by fame or time. They'd sit by the edge, feet dangling above the water, watching the ripples catch the moonlight. She'd rest her head on his lap, eyes closed, listening to the rhythm of his heartbeat. "What are you thinking about?" she'd ask. "Us," he'd answer. "How we started, how far we've come, and how I still feel like I'm falling for you every day." In moments like those, the world felt perfectly still, as if everything existed just to witness them. But perhaps what made their love story so unforgettable was not its beauty, but its honesty. They didn't promise forever. They chose it, again and again, through every storm and sunrise. When he struggled with self-doubt, she became his anchor. When she lost her spark, he became her calm. Together, they built something stronger than fame, softer than time, a love that didn't need to be seen to be real. On the anniversary of their first meeting, they revisited the same studio where it all began. Dust floated through the old lights, and faded scripts still lined the walls. She ran her fingers over the set, smiling wistfully. "We were so young," she said. "We still are," he replied, taking her hand. "Every time I look at you, I feel like we're starting all over again." That evening, They walked through the empty corridors, laughing about the past, reliving lines they once rehearsed. Before they left, she found the old clapperboard from their first scene together. On impulse, she wrote a date on it, the day they met, and handed it to him. "Keep it," she said, "so you'll never forget the take that started it all." And as the door closed behind them, Menglong turned back one last time, the fading light catching the dust in the air like tiny stars. He smiled to himself, knowing that some stories don't end. They echo quietly in every heartbeat, every memory, every shared glance that lingers a second too long. For Menglong and Xing Fei, love was never about the spotlight. It was about the spaces in between, the laughter, the quiet, the gentle moments the world would never see. And in those spaces, their story would live forever, not as a tale of perfection, but as a testament to the beauty of two souls who found home in each other.